"I haven't eaten. In 3 days feed me, and I'll serve you," said the giant cowboy to the rich woman. In the scorched territories of the American frontier where survival carves its truths into human bone, two outcasts discover that salvation sometimes arrives wearing unexpected faces. When desperate hunger meets isolated wealth, when a fallen giant encounters a gilded prisoner, the collision creates something neither society nor circumstance intended: a partnership that defies every rule the world has written about worth belonging and the radical act of choosing your own family. This is the story of Ezra, a 7-foot colossus brought low by honor and empty belly, and Victoria, a widow drowning in silk and silver while starving for authentic connection. In the blistering heat of Silverton's judgment and the cool shadows of inherited shame, they'll discover that sometimes the most profound rebellion is simply refusing to let the world define your value. What happens when two people the world has discarded find each other? What price are you willing to pay for dignity? And when everything you thought you knew about strength and weakness crumbles, what remains? Join us in the comments below. What would you sacrifice to preserve your honor? Have you ever found family in the most unexpected places? The sun was a tyrant ruling over Silverton's main street. Its heat, a physical weight that pressed down on weathered wood and cracked earth with the relentless authority of divine judgment. The air shimmered like truth through tears distorting the buildings into wavering mirages of themselves. Ezra stood in the center of it all. 7 feet of weathered sinew and sun-carved flesh, he cast a shadow that seemed to mock the very concept of shelter. His enormous frame had once been the terror of cattle drives and barroom brawls, a monument to masculine power that lesser men measured themselves against and found wanting. Now, 3 days without food had hollowed him into something elemental, a creature of pure need. His hands capable of breaking a man's neck or gentling a spooked horse with equal grace trembled with the fragile uncertainty of a sparrow's wing. The town watched from behind curtained windows and half-closed doors. Their whispers were a chorus of judgment that carried on the dead air. The giant's fallen far. Look how the mighty tumble when the world stops feeding them. Children pressed their faces to glass, wide-eyed at the spectacle of invincibility made mortal. Women clutched their shawls tighter as if his desperation might be contagious. Men shifted uncomfortably, seeing in his degradation the specter of their own potential ruin. But hunger is democracy's cruelest lesson. It reduces kings and beggars to the same raw mathematics of survival. Ezra's stomach clenched like a fist around emptiness. The pain had evolved beyond mere discomfort into something spiritual, a hollow ache that seemed to echo in his bones. His pride, that magnificent, terrible thing that had sustained him through range wars and broken hearts, lay dying in the dust at his feet. What was dignity when measured against the simple animal need for sustenance? The mercantile's door stood 20 feet away. 20 feet between him and the possibility of bread, of jerky, of anything to fill the growing void inside him. But in his pocket lay only lint and the bitter memory of better days. The owner, Henderson, had made his position clear yesterday. No credit for Drifter's giant. I don't care how tall you stand. A bead of sweat traced a path down Ezra's temple. The salt stung his cracked lips. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of an approaching carriage wheels, on packed earth the measured clip of well-bred horses. Silverton rarely saw such luxury. Most visitors arrived on horseback or in dusty farm wagons. This was different. This was wealth announcing itself with every turn of perfectly balanced wheels. Ezra turned his head slowly, the movement deliberate as cathedral bells. The carriage rounded the corner, and even in his diminished state he recognized quality when he saw it. Black lacquered wood that gleamed despite the dust. Silver fixtures that caught the brutal light and threw it back in defiant sparkles. Horses that moved with the fluid grace of animals that had never known the whip of desperation. The equipage drew to a halt in front of the bank, and the watching town held its collective breath. But who would emerge from such splendor, and what business could bring them to this forgotten corner of the territory? The carriage door opened like the revelation of a secret, and what stepped out defied every expectation Silverton had nurtured about wealth and its obligations. Victoria Blackwood emerged from her carriage like a vision from another world entirely. Pearl buttons caught the harsh light and threw it back as tiny stars across her emerald traveling dress, a defiant splash of color against the town's monochrome despair. Her gloved hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to carry wealth like armor. But her eyes held the particular haunted quality of someone who had discovered that money could buy everything except the one thing she needed most. Widow of the territory's richest silver baron, she carried her status like a beautiful burden. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, now drawn by the magnetic pull of genuine prosperity. Henderson straightened his vest and adjusted his sleeves, already calculating the profit her presence might bring. The banker appeared in his doorway, wringing his hands with obsequious anticipation. Even the children stopped their whispered commentary about the giant to stare at this creature who belonged to fairy tales, not frontier towns. But Victoria's gaze swept past them all and landed with the precision of an arrow, finding its mark on Ezra. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they regarded each other across the dusty expanse of the street. The fallen colossus and the elevated prisoner. The man who had nothing and the woman who had everything except what mattered. In that look, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the obvious boundaries of class and circumstance. She saw not a broken giant, but a magnificent ruin that echoed her own hollow grandeur. "You," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the space between them with the clarity of crystal striking stone. "You look like a man with a story." Ezra's throat worked silently. Words seemed an impossible luxury when every fiber of his being was focused on the simple mechanics of remaining upright. But dignity, even dying dignity, demanded a response. "Ma'am," he managed the word rough as sandpaper on cedar. She approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being watched, to having every gesture dissected for meaning. Her skirts whispered against the earth. The crowd parted before her like water before the prow of a ship, their faces a mixture of awe and bewilderment. When she was close enough that he could smell the faint lavender water that scented her gloves, she stopped. "You're hungry," she said. It wasn't a question. Ezra's jaw tightened. The observation was truth laid bare, undeniable as the sun overhead. To confirm it would be to admit defeat. To deny it would be to lie to someone who clearly possessed the eyes to see through deception. 3 days, he said finally, the admission torn from him like a confession in church. "I have food," Victoria replied, her gaze never wavering. "More than I could eat in a lifetime of lifetimes. And I have work that needs doing. Work that requires—" She paused, studying his massive frame with an appraiser's eye. "Someone substantial." The proposition hung between them like a bridge across an impossible canyon. "Feed me," Ezra said, the words emerging from some primal place beyond pride or shame, "and I'll serve you." A murmur ran through the watching crowd like wind through wheat. Henderson's face darkened with the realization that this interaction was moving beyond his sphere of influence. The banker wrung his hands harder, sensing opportunity slipping through his fingers like water. But Victoria smiled, an expression so sudden and genuine it transformed her entire face, chasing away years of careful composure to reveal the woman beneath the widow's weeds. "Then it's settled," she said, extending one gloved hand toward him. "Welcome to my employ, Mr. Ezra Stone." Her smile widened. "Victoria Blackwood, and Mr. Stone, I believe this arrangement will benefit us both in ways neither of us yet understands." But what forces had driven these two together, and what secrets lay hidden beneath their carefully constructed surfaces? As Victoria's carriage pulled away with Ezra seated beside the driver, his massive frame making the vehicle list slightly to one side, Silverton buzzed with speculation and scandal. None of them could have imagined where this unlikely partnership would lead, or the price the town itself would ultimately pay for its judgment. Victoria's mansion perched on the hill like a jeweled crown on a corpse's head, magnificent, isolated, and haunted by the ghosts of a marriage built on transaction rather than tenderness. The carriage wound up the serpentine drive between rows of perfectly manicured cottonwoods that had never known the chaos of natural growth. Every branch, every leaf, every blade of grass spoke of wealth's ability to impose order on nature's wild impulses. The house itself rose against the evening sky like a monument to loneliness dressed in architectural finery. 3 stories of pristine white clapboard and gleaming windows that reflected the dying light like empty eyes. Ezra felt the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him like a physical force. His clothes, travel-stained and worn thin by too many miles and too little care, seemed to shrink against his frame. The carriage's leather seats, soft as butter and redolent with the scent of privilege, made his skin itch with awareness of how far he had fallen from any world where such luxury was commonplace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Victoria's voice carried a note he couldn't quite identify. Pride, bitterness, something more complex that lived in the space between those emotions. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, though beautiful seemed an insufficient word for something so perfectly empty. The mansion's front doors, mahogany thick enough to stop bullets and carved with intricate rose patterns, swung open as if by magic. A parade of servants emerged, their faces carefully neutral masks of professional discretion. They moved like shadows made flesh, efficient but distant, maintaining the machinery of luxury, while carefully avoiding the machinery of the heart. Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper, stepped forward. Gray-haired and stern-faced, she possessed the particular authority that comes from decades of managing other people's lives while carefully tending to her own survival. "Ma'am," she said, her gaze flickering over Ezra with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read trouble in the cut of a man's clothes and the set of his shoulders. "Mrs. Henley, this is Mr. Stone. He'll be staying in the carriage house and taking care of the outdoor maintenance we've been discussing." Translation rippled across the housekeeper's face like water. She understood the delicate politics of euphemism the careful dance required when propriety and necessity collided in the parlors of the wealthy. "Of course, ma'am. Shall I show him to his quarters? Please, and see that he's fed, properly fed. He's been traveling." Ezra felt the weight of their understanding passing over his head like clouds heavy with rain. These women spoke in a language of implication and inference that his hunger-dulled mind could barely follow. But the promise of food, real food in quantities sufficient to fill the howling void inside him, cut through his confusion like a blade through silk. The carriage house sat 50 yards from the main mansion, connected by a brick pathway that meandered through gardens so perfectly maintained they looked more like paintings than living landscapes. His quarters occupied the upper floor, a single large room with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley below, where Silverton huddled in the shadows like a guilty secret. Mrs. Henley's assistant, a thin woman whose name was Mary or Margaret or something equally forgettable, brought him a tray that made his knees weak with gratitude. Roasted chicken still warm from the oven. Fresh bread with butter so yellow it seemed to glow. Potatoes mashed with cream and herbs. Vegetables that tasted like they had been picked that morning. And coffee, real coffee, not the bitter chicory substitute that had become his standard when he could afford anything at all. He ate slowly, forcing himself to maintain some semblance of dignity, even as every cell in his body screamed for him to devour everything within reach. The flavors were so intense after 3 days of emptiness that they seemed to echo in his bones. From his window he could see Victoria moving through the main house like a ghost in her own domain. Her silhouette passed from room to room, a solitary figure dwarfed by the enormous spaces she commanded. The mansion blazed with electric lights, a luxury few places in the territory could afford, but the illumination only emphasized the profound emptiness that filled every carefully appointed chamber. What kind of life had created such beautiful isolation, and what had driven her to invite a stranger into her carefully guarded world, the next morning brought his first taste of the work that would define his place in this strange new reality. The estate was vast, encompassing not just the house and its immediate grounds, but acres of cultivated landscape that required constant maintenance, fences that needed mending, gardens that demanded weeding, pathways that required clearing, and everywhere the small signs of decline that even unlimited money couldn't prevent: paint that had begun to peel, gutters that sagged under the weight of accumulated debris, stonework that had started to crumble under the relentless assault of time and weather. It was work that suited his massive frame and his need for purposeful action. His hands, idle too long, remembered the satisfaction of fixing broken things, of making order from chaos, of creating something useful and lasting from raw materials and honest effort. And Victoria watched from her silk-curtained windows, fascinated by this man who treated her possessions with more tenderness than her husband ever showed her. 3 weeks passed before the carefully constructed distance between employer and servant began to crumble under the weight of proximity and shared solitude. It started with practical consultations. Victoria would appear on the veranda as Ezra worked in the gardens, ostensibly to discuss the placement of new plantings or the repair of an ornamental fountain that hadn't sung in years. But their conversations stretched beyond the boundaries of their formal arrangement, meandering like the brick pathways that connected the various corners of her cultivated wilderness. "You have gentle hands," she observed one afternoon, watching him coax life back into a rosebush that previous gardeners had declared beyond salvation. "For someone so large," Ezra supplied, not looking up from his delicate work with the pruning shears. "Powerful," she corrected. "There's a difference." He paused in his trimming to meet her gaze. "Size and strength aren't the same thing as roughness, ma'am. Some of the gentlest souls I've known could break a man in half if the need arose, and some of the cruelest never raised their voice above a whisper." Something flickered across Victoria's face, recognition perhaps, or the shadow of old pain. "My late husband was a small man," she said quietly, "in every sense of the word." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But it was there now, this crack in the wall of formal distance, and through it seeped the possibility of something more authentic than employer and employee could ever be. Ezra spoke of the open range with the reverence of a man describing a lost cathedral, the endless sky that made a man feel both infinite and insignificant, the profound silence that taught patience to even the most restless souls, the hard lessons that transformed boys into men and separated the worthy from the merely ambitious. Victoria shared fragments of her gilded cage with the careful precision of someone handling broken glass. She spoke of charity balls where kindness was performed rather than felt of business, dinners where she was displayed like a valuable ornament of the profound loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who saw her wealth before they saw her face. "I married for security," she admitted one evening as they sat on the veranda watching the sun die behind the mountains. "My father's debts were substantial. Martin offered salvation, and I accepted without asking the price." "What was the price?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Everything that mattered. My choices, my voice, my right to be seen as more than a beautiful acquisition." She paused, her fingers whirring the silk of her skirt. "When he died, I inherited his fortune, but I also inherited his prison. But the past is a creditor that always comes to collect, and Silverton's memory was long and unforgiving. Rumors began to circulate like poison in the town's water supply, whispers about Victoria's mysterious first marriage, that had ended in scandal speculation about Ezra's fall from grace involving a wealthy rancher's daughter, and a duel that had left more than one reputation in ruins. The truth as truth often does proved more complex than the gossip that attempted to contain it. Ezra had been born to privilege, the son of a cattle baron whose empire stretched across 3 counties. He'd worn fine clothes and attended Eastern schools, spoke with the polished accent of education and entitlement. But privilege had never sat comfortably on his oversized frame. He preferred the company of ranch hands to dinner parties, found more wisdom in the words of weathered cowboys than in the pronouncements of professors. The scandal that destroyed his former life had been simple in its complexity. He'd defended a young woman's honor against the unwanted advances of a powerful man. The duel that followed had been legal, formal, and utterly devastating. Not because anyone died, both men had survived their wounds, but because the truth of what had precipitated the conflict could never be spoken aloud without destroying the very person Ezra had fought to protect. So he'd accepted exile rather than explanation, chosen disgrace over revelation. But how long could 2 people carry the weight of their secrets before the burden crushed them both? Meanwhile, Victoria's late husband's business partners circled like vultures, sensing opportunity in her isolation and the potential scandal of her unconventional household. Harrison Webb, a man whose ambition was matched only by his capacity for cruelty, had begun making inquiries about the vagrant living on her property. The storm was gathering, and neither Victoria nor Ezra yet understood the devastation it would bring, or the strength they would discover in facing it together. The storm broke not from the sky, but from the poison of small minds and smaller hearts. Harrison Webb arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air hung thick with the promise of violence and the sweet stench of righteous indignation. He came not alone, but at the head of a carefully orchestrated procession, Sheriff Martinez, his hand resting conspicuously on his service weapon, Dr. Thornfield, the town's physician and moral authority, Reverend Pike, whose sermons had grown increasingly fevered in recent weeks, and a handful of concerned citizens, whose concern extended primarily to their own standing in the community's rigid hierarchy. Victoria watched their approach from the mansion's front windows, her silk curtains held aside by fingers that trembled with something far beyond fear. Beside her, Mrs. Henley stood like a sentinel, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the hard lines of her weathered face. "Shall I fetch Mr. Stone, ma'am?" the housekeeper asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of other people's scandals. "No," Victoria replied, her voice steady, despite the chaos churning in her chest. "This is my responsibility, my choice, my consequence to face." The delegation arranged itself on her circular drive like pieces on a chessboard, their positioning carefully calculated to project both authority and threat. Webb stepped forward, his pale face flushed with the particular excitement that comes from finally cornering prey that has eluded capture for too long. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying the false courtesy that barely concealed his true intentions. "We need to discuss the situation you've created here." Victoria emerged onto her veranda with the measured grace of someone who had learned to treat every public appearance as a performance. Her emerald dress caught the morning light, transforming her into something that seemed to glow with its own internal fire. She was magnificent in her defiance, terrible in her composure. "Mr. Webb," she replied, her voice carrying across the space between them with crystal clarity. "How unexpected, and how thoroughly you've prepared for this conversation. We have eviction papers," Webb announced, producing a legal document with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. "Signed by Judge Hartwell. Your association with this vagrant has created a public nuisance, a moral hazard that cannot be tolerated in a civilized community." The words hit Victoria like physical blows, but she didn't flinch. "This is my property, Mr. Webb, and Mr. Stone is my employee. I fail to see how either constitutes a public concern. The man is a drifter. Sheriff Martinez interjected his voice, carrying the weary authority of someone who had delivered this speech too many times before. No fixed address, no local references. For all we know, he could be dangerous. And you, ma'am. Reverend Pike added, his voice trembling with moral outrage, have placed yourself in a position that invites scandal. A woman of your standing living in such proximity to a man of his reputation. But they had underestimated both the giant they sought to crush and the woman they presumed to save. The sound of approaching footsteps cut through their moral pontificating like a blade through silk. Ezra emerged from the carriage house, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of a man who had finally remembered what he was fighting for. 3 weeks of regular meals had restored some of the power to his movements, but it was more than physical nourishment that had transformed him. It was purpose. It was belonging. It was the revolutionary realization that he had found something worth defending. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that true strength never needed to announce, "I believe you're trespassing." Webb's face contorted with rage and something that might have been fear. "You dare. I dare quite a bit when it comes to protecting what's mine to protect." Ezra interrupted, his gray eyes holding Webb's with unwavering intensity. "And this property, this woman, and this arrangement are all under my protection now." "Your protection?" Webb laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You're nothing but a vagrant who's taken advantage of a grief-stricken widow. We're here to correct that mistake." The confrontation erupted into violence with the suddenness of summer lightning. Webb's hired men, 3 rough-looking individuals whose presence had been carefully disguised as concerned citizens, moved toward Ezra with the coordinated precision of professional thugs. They had expected to overwhelm a single man through sheer numbers and the element of surprise. They discovered too late that they had gravely miscalculated. Ezra moved like a force of nature given human form. His first blow sent the largest of Webb's men flying backward into the ornamental fountain, where he landed with a splash that sent water cascading over the carefully maintained garden beds. The second attacker found himself lifted bodily from the ground and deposited with surprising gentleness in the branches of a nearby oak tree. The third man, demonstrating more wisdom than his companions, raised his hands in surrender and backed slowly away. But it was Victoria who delivered the final devastating blow to Webb's ambitions. As the businessman reached for the pistol concealed beneath his coat, she stepped forward with the fluid grace of someone who had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone suspected. "I wouldn't," she said, her voice carrying a note that froze Webb in place. "You see, Harrison, I know things. About you. About your business practices. About the way you've been systematically defrauding the territorial government of mining fees. About the accident at your mine last year that killed 3 men because you refused to invest in proper safety equipment." Webb's face went white as plaster. "You can't prove. I can prove everything." Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Martin kept meticulous records. He may have been many things, but he was never careless with information. And when I inherited his estate, I inherited his secrets. All of them." She reached into her bodice and withdrew a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but its contents clearly legible. "Your choice, Harrison. Walk away now, and these secrets remain between us. Continue this harassment, and I'll ensure that Judge Hartwell and the territorial authorities receive copies of every incriminating page." The truth was a weapon sharper than any blade, and Victoria wielded it with surgical precision. Webb stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. His carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the frightened, desperate man beneath the bluster and false authority. Without another word, he turned and stalked toward his carriage, his delegation of concerned citizens trailing behind him like whipped dogs. As the dust of their retreat settled over the mansion's perfectly maintained drive, Victoria and Ezra stood together in the sudden silence, their breathing still sharp from the confrontation they had just survived. "That journal," Ezra said quietly. "What's really in it?" Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her face with its genuine warmth. "Recipes, household accounts, a few pressed flowers from our wedding bouquet." She tucked the innocuous volume back into her bodice. "Sometimes the appearance of a weapon is more powerful than the weapon itself." For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Ezra threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that echoed across the valley and seemed to chase away the last shadows of their old, careful distance. In the aftermath of the storm, Silverton was forced to reckon with its own reflection, and many found the image less flattering than they had expected. Some of the townspeople, having witnessed Victoria and Ezra's courage in the face of persecution, began to question the mob they had nearly joined. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, stopped by the mansion the following week with a basket of fresh-baked bread and an apology that carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I should have known better," she said simply. "Fear makes fools of us all." Henderson, the mercantile owner who had refused Ezra credit during his darkest hour, appeared at the kitchen door with hat in hand and humility in his eyes. "I've got work," he offered quietly. "Loading supplies, moving inventory. Fair wages for fair work, if you're interested." Others, led by Webb's remaining allies, doubled down on their hatred, but their power had been broken by the exposure of their true motives. Without Webb's money and influence to fuel their righteous indignation, their protests devolved into impotent grumbling that carried no more weight than wind through empty bottles. But the most profound transformation occurred within the mansion itself. Victoria and Ezra made their choice not in words but in actions. The mansion's doors, once sealed against the world by grief and propriety, opened to those whom society had discarded. The spare bedrooms that had gathered dust for years began to house travelers who had nowhere else to turn. The vast dining room that had echoed with loneliness now filled with the voices of people who understood the particular hunger that food alone could never satisfy. There was Martha the seamstress, whose arthritis had cost her the fine motor skills that defined her livelihood. Victoria set up a workshop in the mansion's sunroom, where Martha could teach younger women the arts of needlework and design while earning a living wage for supervisory work her hands could still manage. There was Samuel, a former slave whose freedom had come with neither resources nor welcome in most communities. Ezra recognized in the older man's weathered hands the same careful skill with growing things that his own possessed, and together they transformed Victoria's ornamental gardens into productive plots that fed both body and soul. There was young Rebecca, unmarried and with child, who had been cast out by her family for the crime of loving unwisely. Mrs. Henley took her under her wing, teaching her the management skills that would ensure she could always find employment in households that valued competence over moral judgment. The broken fountain sang again its voice, now accompanied by the laughter of children who played in its spray, while their parents worked in the gardens or learned new trades in the workshops that sprouted like flowers throughout the estate's grounds. Victoria discovered that wealth's true power lay not in what it could accumulate, but in what it could set free. Every door she opened, every opportunity she created, every life she touched, became a seed that would grow into something larger than her individual fortune could ever achieve. And Ezra found that strength was not diminished by gentleness, but magnified by it. His massive hands, which had once been feared for their capacity for violence, became instruments of creation and protection. Children who had initially hidden from his intimidating presence began to seek him out, climbing on his broad shoulders and listening with rapt attention to his stories of the open range. Their relationship, born from desperation and nurtured by mutual respect, evolved into something neither could have imagined, not romance in the traditional sense, but a partnership that transcended conventional categories. They were collaborators in the radical act of redefining what family could mean. Allies in the revolutionary notion that worth wasn't measured by what you owned, but by how you treated those who had nothing to offer you in return. One evening, as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Victoria found Ezra sitting on the veranda with Rebecca's infant daughter sleeping peacefully in his enormous arms. The sight stopped her in her tracks, this giant of a man reduced to gentle whispers and careful movements by the trust of a tiny child who saw nothing threatening in his size or history. "She's beautiful," Victoria said quietly, settling into the chair beside him. "All children are beautiful," Ezra replied, his voice soft with wonder. "They haven't learned yet that the world expects them to be anything other than exactly what they are." Victoria watched the baby's tiny fingers curl around one of Ezra's calloused digits, marveling at the complete absence of fear in the gesture. "Is that what we're doing here? Creating a place where people can be exactly what they are?" "Maybe," Ezra said thoughtfully. "Or maybe we're just proving that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose, something you build, stone by stone, choice by choice, with people who see your true face and love it anyway." The mansion on the hill had become more than a house. It was a statement, a declaration that the world's definitions of worth and belonging were not the only definitions available, that outcasts could create their own societies, that broken things, when fitted together with care and imagination, could become stronger than their original forms. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Victoria and Ezra sat in comfortable silence, watching over their chosen family with the quiet satisfaction of gardeners who had planted seeds in barren ground and watched them grow into something magnificent. The giant who once begged for bread now broke bread with others who hungered not just for food, but for dignity, acceptance, and the radical notion that everyone deserved a place at the table of human community. If this story of transformation and chosen family moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of the human spirit's capacity to create beauty from brokenness. Share your own stories of unexpected family in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single act of kindness between strangers.